Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. Co-host today, Daniel McAdams, with me again. Thank you, Daniel, for being here.
Good morning, Dr. Paul. Good to be here with you.
You know, the big event just recently has been, of course, the bombings in Brussels and people killed, which deserves some attention, but sometimes I think it gets more attention compared to some of the killing that goes on. I've always wondered why they don't care about the war on drugs in this country. I think in this country, you know, we incarcerate so many people, and approximately 50 people get murdered in this country, which is serious. But in comparison, you know, this is much bigger. And you can't say this because they're going to say, well, you don't care. But anyway, the aftermath of this is a big discussion on how to make ourselves safe. And the one thing for sure that they haven't talked about is the change of foreign policy involving European nations, the United States, and maybe having less interference in the Middle East, which is construed by many in the Middle East as an invasion and a crusade and all this. No, that part isn't being discussed. So they're coming up with other things. In the Jerusalem Post just yesterday came out with an article, said that Europeans should be more like Israel to make themselves safe, and they had some suggestions. But the one is, you have to sacrifice a little bit liberty. And of course, I don't like that idea, and libertarians should never concede this. And our question on our program today is, should Europe sacrifice more liberty? I know where I stand on this, and I suspect I know where you stand on this. But what do you make of this article coming out at this particular time, advising that we be more like Israel? Their circumstances are somewhat different, but that's the comparison they want to make.
Yeah, I mean, this is just one article that caught our attention, but I'm sure there are dozens of others. When an event like this happens, it really is a boon for the so-called security experts, because they all come out of the woodwork saying, you need more security, you need to give up your liberty. This is the only solution. In the Paris attacks of last year, France put out a Patriot Act-like legislation, and they had it on the shelf, so they were ready to do it. But this, Dina Lisnyavsky of the Jerusalem Post, she pointed out, I think that Europe is a strong supporter of personal freedoms, but on these terms, it is impossible to continue. So the idea is they've got to give this up, and the expert says you can't just let people in the airport. You've got to thoroughly screen them. You've got to do more surveillance. You've got to do all these things. Be more like us, like you say. But the question that I had when I read it, well, how is this working out for Israel? It's not considered that safe of a place to be.
You know, when you were making that statement, I thought you should have emphasized one word a little bit more, and it reminded me of a story, and it's but. You go along, but, the exception is, and Leonard Reed from the Foundation for Economic Education used to talk about this, and he said that, everybody's for liberty, and they all have buts. Yes, I'm for freedom, but when it affects me, and this sort of thing. So it's a good statement. But our friend Jeff Dice, president of the Mises Institute, came up with a nice article dealing with this subject.
Yeah, Mises ran it, and we picked it up on the Institute's website, and it's about the issue of the market, and isn't there a better way to fight terrorism? And Jeff points out, no one blames the government when the government fails tremendously to prevent terrorist attacks, like the one we saw in Brussels, like San Bernardino, like Paris, etc. And he points out that, as a matter of fact, when these terrorist attacks happen, it's often very beneficial for governments, because rather than get blamed for failing, they get lots more resources. Look at the militarization of the police after 9/11. They went on a shopping spree to beat all shopping sprees. So they actually benefit because there is no market factor when government provides goods.
And he's emphasizing the notion that much of our security could be privatized, security on airplanes and whatnot, and we'd be all better off. But he also makes the point that the general response from the left is we need more welfare programs, we need more integration, we need more government management on these social things, and yet the conservatives in our country especially and elsewhere say, oh no, we need more bombs and we need more threat and we need more, this is a good excuse to increase the military budget. It seems like I can't find one Democrat, unless they're running on a libertarian party, that would even suggest that you could cut military spending. So one side wants more militarism, the other one's more welfareism and socialism and social planning. But I think that one question we might try to address is this issue now. They're suggesting we give up liberty for security, but have the American people, have the Europeans given up liberty already? Could having given up liberty prior to this been a contributing factor, to the problem? And so it's not like people haven't given up their liberties. And I know there's people in Europe right now thinking that they have given up a lot of liberty, and we here in this country think we have too. Giving up more liberty is hardly going to solve our problems.
Yeah, Jeff points out, the part you're saying about the left and the right, Jeff points out that these represent ideological differences between the two, and he makes a position that libertarianism really shouldn't be considered an ideology, but rather a lack of ideology, and introducing the idea of pragmatism, what works in the situation. And everyone, if you say privatize security, it's a big bogeyman. But Jeff makes the point that private actors with their own money and reputations at risk can provide the appropriate level of security. If you own an airplane and you have too much security, people aren't going to ride it. It's just going to be a nightmare. If you have too little, then you're going to have problems. So they have every incentive in the world to find the right balance between the two, because they have to appeal to their customers. Governments don't have those restraints.
Right. We're sitting in a place that we're probably less than a mile from the Dow chemical plant, a major plant in Texas. And the sheriff doesn't protect them. The local police force doesn't protect them. They have private security. And I've lived here for nearly 50 years, and I've never heard of anybody getting into that plant. I mean, their security is very secure. But I think the giving up of sovereignty is giving up liberty. And what has the European Union been other than giving up sovereignty of the individual as well as their country's sovereignty, and then writing these artificial laws where you have social programs and welfare programs that are offered to people who can just sort of bust their way in. And not only that, is the loss of liberty allows our governments to pursue wars that quite frankly aren't morally justified, and it wasn't under attack, and we've been in the Middle East for a long time, so we help create the migrants that are coming in, and also they accept an economic policy that's always encroaching on our liberties. All Keynesianism and inflationism, this is all an encroachment of personal liberties, causing this disturbance that then it gets out of control and people get angry, then they start killing each other. And I would think a number that someday somebody could produce, if you ever compared the number of Muslims and Arabs that have been killed since 1990. So essentially, we've been very much involved in remaking the Middle East compared to the ruthless killings of Al-Qaeda. And they are ruthless, but you cannot even say that, because that is not a comparison. Because anytime we kill somebody who's not an authentic a terrorist, then that was an accident. It wasn't intentional. And we even go to the extent when we bomb hospitals, like just happened this week, that we go and apologize, which is fine. But that to me is such an insult. They go out and give them a few $1,000s. I'm not even sure. Do you think that's going to appease these people and solve their problem by saying, oh, we're sorry we hit your hospital? And do you think the people who are radicalized against us see a difference?
Yeah, you sent me over this article this morning. I think it was in the New York Times, where the new general in charge went to the hospital to give an apology 6 months later, and the reaction of the people was interesting. They were not interested in hearing this apology. They were furious because they knew the circumstance of the bombings. They knew what had happened. They knew that the U.S. knew that the hospital was there. And so, yeah, you're right, an apology after the fact didn't do much for these people with their hands blown off. And
well, you mentioned about, the Europeans have a Patriot Act. And of course, we are the biggest and richest and most militant country in the world. We're very, very powerful. But if you challenge that notion. It's very unpopular. Nobody wants to be self-critical. Nobody wants to even criticize themselves, let alone criticize your own country. That's treasonous to do this. And yet, we have, what we saw though after 9/11 was of course the passage of the Patriot Act. But we are the exceptional nations, and we can spread American goodness around the world even if it takes force. And that in itself, I think, is a contributing factor, but it's almost impossible to break through the political correctness of this and say, you know, you have to look at this if you want to try to understand violence. The immediate reaction will be, oh, you're giving them an excuse. And obviously, libertarians don't give anybody excuses for initiating violence. You know, we don't want the violence, and we're trying to prevent it. But we want to try to get people to understand and assume responsibility and understand how these things come about. And that's why I think Jeff's article was good, and there'll be other articles that will come out, but they won't get evening news coverage.
Yeah. You know, I was having a discussion with a couple of fellow analyst friends of mine this morning about the Jerusalem Post article, and I made the comment that, you know, taking away liberty for security is really treating the symptom, not the cause of terrorism being aggressive foreign policy, etc. And one friend of mine, who you know, he hasn't, I won't mention his name, but he made an interesting point. He said maybe it's not about cause and effect or symptom and cause at all. Maybe it's all just a ruse. You know, maybe they're using this to introduce the ideas of authoritarianism into people's minds, into the public discussion. He said, after all, the Reichstag fire was not about symptom or cause. It was a ruse for Hitler to grab power more. So that's a little bit cynical, but it's worth considering.
Well, it's a continuation of what's been going on, because I'd like to introduce this notion that we can counteract the philosophy of authoritarianism, because that's been around for thousands of years. That's the nature of people who like to rule over others. They get involved in governments, and that's why governments can be so dangerous, and also the reason governments should be a lot smaller.
Yeah. Well, I like the way Jeff finished out his article. He said the real goal of the libertarian ideology, and he put it in quotes, the real goal of the libertarian ideology is a better world, not a perfect world.
Right. And, you know, once again, dealing with problems and the symptoms, why don't the Europeans look and see if all these laws that we passed against ourselves, we worry about losing our liberties to the foreign invaders and Al-Qaeda that are going to come and take us over, but our greatest threat to our liberties, and don't say this in public, we can say it on our program, is our own government. Yeah. They're the ones who take away our liberties, but they say, well, that's necessary so that somebody else doesn't come in here and take away our liberties. We overtax and overregulate and make these assumptions, and they take care, like you mentioned, take care of symptoms. But just like in economics, it is taught that if you have a problem out there that seems to be needing to address, maybe there is already a problem created by government. So if you write a regulation to deal with that problem, Mises says you'll create two new problems. So the momentum is there, and this authoritarianism is a continuation of this, and they're always justifying it. That's why I think this particular election this year is so useless, because they are so far removed, which is generally the case from the real issues, and they just go back and forth, and they're arguing over power and who's going to run things. Matter of fact, I see it just a distraction from the whole problems, and that's why, you know, the planned effort to distract and blame other people, that's ongoing, because most people, if they're honest with themselves, and many people accept this, that there hasn't been any significant difference between the two parties. And I think this is one reason why some candidates seem to be a little bit more popular, both on the left and the right, because they're saying, yeah, we're recognizing that. We really want to make ourselves different. But I don't believe in their heart there's any difference in giving up authoritarianism. They just want to be the authorities, you know, whether they're leftists or rightists. They want to be the ones who will dictate, and I don't see that as a solution.
Yeah, you know, I think as horrible as these terrorist attacks are, the reaction of the government when you put it all together is probably even worse.
Yeah, that is for sure. I want to thank the audience for tuning in today, and obviously I'm sure you knew our position on whether or not we should sacrifice more liberty for safety and security. Of course not. We shouldn't do it. And I have said many times in campaigns and got good, loud, almost like universal applause when I say you never have to sacrifice liberty for safety. Matter of fact, if you give that up, you lose your ability to make yourself secure. We're not secure in our homes because there's a policeman standing out in front of our house protecting us. They don't prevent crimes. And this is a lot of what's going on. They claim they have to prevent crimes and round up people and these sorts of things. But I would say that using common sense and using the law as it provides us ability to protect ourselves in the Second Amendment, that probably does a lot more to protect us than all these rules and regulations and the prodding and the nonsense at airports and the giving up of our privacy. I mean, this is so bad that we are our greatest enemy when it comes to the protection of liberty. And to suggest that the Europeans have so much liberty that they're anxious to give up some more. We shouldn't be anxious to give up our liberty in this country. We shouldn't in any place in the world be willing to give up liberty. This world suffers from the lack of liberty and the lack of understanding and the fear that lack of liberty would lead to chaos. Quite frankly, it's the chaos that we're facing today that is coming about because we don't understand and promote liberty. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today, and please come back soon to the Liberty Report.